The rain had been falling on Raincrest City for 11 days straight. Not the gentle, romantic kind that pattered softly against window panes and made people feel poetic. This was the other kind. The kind that came sideways, that flooded gutters and drowned street signs, and made the whole city feel like it was slowly being swallowed by something ancient and indifferent. Tonight, it had graduated from a downpour to something that meteorologists on the local news were calling a once-in-a-decade event, their voices carrying a thin edge of genuine alarm beneath their professional composure. Maya Calloway was not watching the news. She was standing in the center of her studio apartment in the Millfield district, holding a piece of paper in both hands, reading the same 3 sentences for the 5th time, as if repetition might somehow change their meaning. The eviction notice was printed on bright yellow paper, which she supposed was meant to be eye-catching, though she thought fluorescent orange might have been more appropriate given the absolute destruction it was causing to her evening. 30 days! She had 30 days to either produce 4 months of back rent or vacate the premises. She set the paper down on her kitchen counter very carefully, the way a person sets down a glass they are afraid of dropping. Then she looked around the apartment. It was small enough that the looking did not take long. A narrow galley kitchen, a living area that doubled as her studio, canvases stacked against every available wall in various states of completion, a bathroom with a shower head that had a grudge against water pressure, and a second room, technically a bedroom, but closer in size to a generous closet, that she had been renting out to a rotating cast of short-term tenants for the past 2 years to supplement what the coffee shop paid her. The last tenant had left 3 weeks ago without warning, and without paying his final 2 months. Before him, there had been a gap of 6 weeks. The math, when she finally did it, had not been kind. She pulled out her phone and looked at the roommate listing she had posted 4 days ago. She had included a photo of the room, a description that was honest about the size and optimistic about the charm, and a monthly rate that she knew was low for the district. She had received 3 responses. One had been a scam. One had been a man who, after a very long and increasingly strange series of messages, had asked if she would be open to a roommate who was also technically her life coach. The third had been a brief, terse reply that said only, "I'll take it. When can I see it?" No question mark. No introduction. No name beyond the initial G. She had replied with her address and a time window of 6 to 9 in the evening. It was now 8:30, and she had more or less given up. Then the knock came. It wasn't a knock so much as a sound that made the door shudder in its frame. 3 impacts, heavy and deliberate, like someone had decided that the conventional purpose of a door was a technicality. The kind of knock that did not ask whether this was a convenient time. Maya's first instinct was to check that her deadbolt was engaged. Her second instinct was to feel embarrassed about her first instinct. She crossed to the door, went up on her toes to look through the peephole, and went very still. The peephole distorted things, stretched and curved the image at the edges, but even through the fisheye lens, what she was looking at was unmistakably a very large man. Very large in the way that certain things were very large. Sequoias, freight ships, the specific category of problem that arrived in your life and fundamentally reorganized your sense of scale. He was wearing a dark suit that had clearly cost more than her monthly rent, possibly more than her annual rent, and it was absolutely soaked through, the fabric clinging to shoulders so broad she had to tilt her mental image to fit him in the doorframe. His hair was dark and plastered flat by the rain. His jaw looked like it had been quarried rather than grown. He was staring directly at the peephole with the focused, patient expression of a man who was accustomed to waiting for things he had already decided he would receive. He looked, she thought, like someone a very powerful person hired to make other powerful people nervous. She unlocked the deadbolt, put the chain on, and opened the door 2 inches. "Hi," she said. "G. Wolf." His voice was a low, controlled baritone, the kind of voice that belonged in boardrooms or interrogation rooms. "I messaged about the room." She looked at him through the 2-inch gap. "Do you have ID?" He reached into his jacket pocket with the mechanical efficiency of someone for whom all physical movements were deliberate and produced a card. She took it, examined it. It was a basic identification card, the kind available at any government office, the photo a perfect and unsettling match to the face on the other side of her door. Gideon Wolf. 31 years old, Raincrest City address, a street in the financial district she vaguely recognized as expensive. "That's a nice neighborhood," she said, sliding the chain free and opening the door. "Was," he said. He stepped inside. The apartment was not a large space. Maya had lived in it for 3 years and had grown accustomed to its proportions, the specific geometry of moving through it without thinking. The moment Gideon Wolf crossed the threshold, every spatial relationship she had memorized became irrelevant. He simply occupied the room differently than other people did, with a density that was more than just physical size, a gravitational quality that made the air in the apartment feel slightly rearranged. And then he stopped. He stopped so completely and so suddenly that Maya, who had been turning to close the door behind him, turned back in alarm. He was standing in the center of her living space, absolutely motionless, his broad back to her, his head tilted a fraction of a degree, not toward her, but in the way of something that had heard a sound too faint for ordinary ears. "Are you okay?" she asked. A pause that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. "Fine." She watched him, curious. A small muscle had jumped in his jaw. His hands, hanging at his sides, had closed briefly into fists, and then deliberately, carefully, opened again. Whatever the moment was, he seemed to be working through it with considerable internal effort. Then he turned around, and his face was composed and neutral, dark eyes sweeping the apartment with the quick, cataloging assessment of a man who professionally evaluated rooms for threats. "Small," he said. "Cozy," she countered automatically. She had been correcting that particular adjective for 3 years. The ghost of something moved across his face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was what a smile might look like if a smile had been described to someone who had never personally experienced one. She showed him the room. It took approximately 45 seconds, which was how long it took to open the door, gesture at the narrow bed, the single window overlooking the alley, and the small wardrobe that listed slightly to the left. Gideon stood in the doorway. He did not attempt to enter, possibly because entering would have left no remaining room in the room, and looked at it with an expression that she could not decipher. "The bathroom is shared," she said. "There's a schedule on the door, but honestly, I'm usually out by 7, so mornings are mostly yours. I work at a coffee shop in the arts district, afternoons and some evenings. I paint when I'm home, which can be loud if I'm in a certain kind of mood, but I always use headphones after 10. She paused. "You said you were a bodyguard?" "Was," he said again. "Lost the contract. The firm," a brief compression of his jaw, "went under. I'm between positions." She nodded. That explained the expensive suit, she supposed. A bodyguard for serious clients would need to dress the part. "References?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Gone. With the firm." She chewed her lip, doing the math that the eviction notice had already forced her to do several times that evening. "The rate is—" "I know the rate." He reached inside his jacket and produced an envelope. He held it out. She took it, opened it, and went quiet for a moment. The bills inside were organized with a neatness that was almost aggressive, banded in groups. It was 3 months of rent, in cash, in an envelope that he had simply had in his jacket. This is a lot," she said. "First and last month's, plus deposit," he said. "And 1 extra, for any inconvenience." She looked at the money. She looked at the eviction notice, still sitting on the counter in her peripheral vision, bright and yellow and 29 days away. She looked at the man filling her doorway, soaking wet, perfectly still, watching her with an expression she would later describe as someone trying very hard to look like they didn't care about the answer to a question. "Okay," she said. "You can move in tonight if you want. I'll get you a key." Something shifted in his face. It was minor and brief, and she almost missed it entirely. But for just a fraction of a second, the controlled neutrality broke, and what was underneath it was something vast and quiet, and almost painful in its intensity. Then it was gone. "Good," he said. He did not have luggage. He had a single bag that he retrieved from the hallway in one trip, and he carried it with the ease of a man for whom physical weight was largely theoretical. Maya made tea, offered him a cup, which he accepted without drinking, and showed him where she kept the extra towels. By 10 o'clock, the apartment was quiet, both of them on their respective sides of the thin wall that divided the main room from the small bedroom. Maya fell asleep quickly, the way she usually did, deeply and without ceremony, the rain hammering at the windows, her chestnut curls sprawled across her pillow. On the other side of the wall, Gideon Wolf sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark, still fully dressed, his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. The bed was roughly the size of a camping cot. His feet extended past the frame. He did not move. He did not sleep. He stared at the wall with eyes that had, very gradually, begun to glow a dim and feral amber in the absolute dark, and he listened to the soft, even sound of his fated mate breathing, and he understood, with the quiet, devastating certainty of a man who had survived every war the world had thrown at him, that he had never been less prepared for anything in his life. By the third morning, Maya had developed a theory about Gideon Wolf. The theory was that he had been raised, possibly by very serious people in a very serious institution, to believe that showing any sign of human comfort or ease was a form of surrender. He sat at her small kitchen table the way a general might sit at a field command post, straight-backed, watchful, hands wrapped around his coffee mug with a grip that suggested the mug had not yet earned his trust. He ate whatever she put in front of him with the focused efficiency of a man refueling. He said please and thank you with the slightly stiff delivery of someone who had learned the phrases phonetically and was still practicing the cadence. He was also, she had noticed, awake before her every single morning. She didn't know when he slept. She wasn't entirely sure he did. "You don't have to eat what I make," she told him on Thursday, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs across the counter. "I mean, it's included in the rent, I said that, but you can just get your own stuff if you have preferences." He looked at the eggs. He looked at her. "These are fine. I'm just saying, you can contribute to groceries if you want. Or cook. Whatever. I'm not running a hotel." She poured herself coffee, turned to face him. "Do you cook?" A pause. "Some." She waited, in case that sentence had a second half. It did not. "Cool," she said. "Well, the kitchen is yours too." He nodded and returned his attention to the eggs, and that was that. What she did not know, because she left for the coffee shop at noon and did not return until after 7, was that Gideon spent the interim hours of that particular Thursday on his phone, moving through a sequence of calls and messages with the quiet, absolute efficiency of a man who had spent a decade building an empire and was now deploying a portion of its infrastructure to fix a barista's apartment. The conversation she had mentioned the previous evening, delivered brightly, without any real complaint, in the way she delivered most things, had been about her espresso machine. "It's dying," she'd said, laughing a little, standing on her toes to reach the cabinet above the refrigerator. "The pressure gauge is basically decorative at this point. I've been making pour-over, like a person who has given up on joy." She had been talking to herself as much as to him. She did that, he had noticed. Produced a running commentary on the texture of her own life, light and wry, apparently requiring no response. He had been reading on the couch, or appearing to read, which was different. He had filed the information about the espresso machine the way he filed all information, immediately, completely, and with a specific intention attached. Maya walked into her kitchen on Friday morning and stopped in the doorway. The machine on her counter was extraordinary. It was the kind of machine that lived in the back kitchens of very serious restaurants, stainless steel and heavy brass fittings, with dual boilers and a pressure gauge that was clearly not decorative, a portafilter that required 2 hands and a certain respect for the process. It was also extremely aggressively large. It occupied roughly a third of her counter space. It was surrounded by 2 bags of single-origin beans she had never seen in any shop she'd been in, and a small handwritten card that simply said, "On sale." Gee. She stared at it for a long time. Then she went and knocked on his door. He opened it immediately, fully dressed at 6:40 in the morning, and looked down at her with his standard expression, which was the expression of a man who was waiting to hear what the problem was so he could begin solving it. "That machine," she said, pointing toward the kitchen. "On sale," he said. "Gideon, that machine costs a lot less than it should." He held her gaze. His dark eyes were completely steady. "You said yours was broken." She opened her mouth, closed it, looked back toward the kitchen. She knew enough about commercial equipment to know that what was sitting on her counter was worth more than her monthly salary, and possibly her monthly salary twice. She also knew, looking at him, that he was not going to tell her what he had actually paid for it, and that pressing the issue would get her exactly nowhere. "You're unbelievable," she said, but she was smiling when she said it. Something shifted in his jaw. "I'll make the coffee," he said, and stepped past her. He made extraordinary coffee. This did not surprise her, given that he seemed to approach everything with the same focused competence. But it was still slightly disarming to watch him move through the process, measuring, tamping, pulling the shot, with the focused attention of someone for whom precision was not a personality trait so much as a baseline condition of existing. He set a cup in front of her without comment. She tasted it and briefly forgot to be confused about the machine. "This is obscene," she said. He sat down with his own cup. "It's coffee. This is not just coffee. This is a religious experience in a mug." She took another sip, and he looked away from her, and the muscle in his jaw did the thing it sometimes did, tightening briefly as if against an involuntary response. She missed it because she was busy being delighted by the coffee. The evenings were different. She had expected, given his general disposition, that Gideon would be the kind of roommate who retreated to his room and emerged only for necessary functions. He was not. He was, instead, the kind of roommate who materialized in the kitchen at 6:30 and produced dinner with the grim, purposeful energy of a man completing a mission, working through the process without comment or ceremony, his large hands moving with surprising efficiency through whatever he had apparently bought at the market during the hours she was at work. She came home on Tuesday to find 2 bone-in ribeyes resting on a cutting board, and Gideon at the stove wearing her spare apron, the one with the small painted sunflowers on the bib, and looking so profoundly, magnificently irritated about the apron's existence that she had to set down her bag and compose herself before she could enter the kitchen. "I have aprons," she offered. "I'm aware." He flipped one of the steaks with a pair of tongs. He did not look at her. "They're all like this. I like sunflowers." He set the tongs down, turned, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had opinions about that but had decided, for reasons that were his own, not to voice them. "Sit down," he said. "It's almost ready." She sat down. The steaks were extraordinary. Everything he cooked was extraordinary. She had mentioned this once, and he had looked at her as if she had said something mildly baffling, and said with complete sincerity that it was just protein, and she had decided that this was the kind of man who cooked Michelin-level food, and genuinely did not understand what was notable about that. She was thinking about the steak, about whether she should offer again to pay for groceries, about whether he would accept, about the small, unexplainable way the apartment felt different with him in it, less like a place she was losing, and more like a place that had weight and substance, when the knock came. This knock was nothing like the first one. It was loose and careless, the knock of someone who was not asking so much as announcing. Maya was closest to the door. She crossed to it and opened it without looking through the peephole, and she had barely registered the face before the mood in her chest shifted sideways into something cold. Derek was leaner than she remembered, with the sharp, tailored look he always reached for when he wanted to seem like someone who had figured things out. He smiled at her with the particular smile of a man who believed that smiling was a form of leverage. "Hey, Maya." He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "You're not returning my messages." Because I don't want to talk to you, she said. Her voice came out steady, which she was grateful for. Derek, I asked you not to come here. I just want to talk. He pushed off the frame and stepped into the doorway, and she stepped back, and his hand shot out and caught her wrist, and his smile didn't change at all when he did it. 5 minutes! Come on! She pulled. He held on. And then a door opened. She heard it more than she saw it, the bathroom door, down the short hallway behind her. Then the hallway went quiet in a way that hallways didn't usually go quiet, a specific pressurized kind of quiet, and she watched Derek's face change. The casual confidence drained out of it so completely and so quickly that it left him looking like a different person. She turned around. Gideon was standing in the hallway. He had clearly just gotten out of the shower. He had a towel around his waist and nothing else. And the nothing else was significant, because without the suit and the jacket and the carefully maintained geometry of expensive clothing, what was underneath was staggering. His torso was a landscape of extreme, densely built muscle, shoulders that belonged on a different scale of creature, a chest that tapered to an abdomen that looked carved rather than grown, and scars. She had not expected the scars. Long and pale and numerous, the kind of marks that came from things she did not want to think about, crossing his chest and ribs and arms in patterns that told a story she didn't have the context to read. He was looking at Derek. He was not moving. He was not raising his voice. He was not doing anything that could technically be described as threatening. He was simply standing there, steam still curling from the bathroom behind him, and the air pressure in the apartment had somehow changed. Derek let go of Maya's wrist. Gideon walked forward. He didn't rush. There was something in how he moved that was worse than rushing, the measured, inevitable quality of something that had already decided how this ended. He reached Derek in 4 steps, and his hand came up, and he wrapped it around Derek's throat with the casual precision of a man picking up an object, and lifted. Derek's feet left the floor. He made a sound. Gideon looked at him the way a person looks at a mildly inconvenient door that needs to be opened. Then he walked Derek backward 3 steps into the hallway outside the apartment, set him down, and released him. Derek hit the wall, then his knees. Then he scrambled upright, and he was gone, footsteps clattering down the stairwell without a single word exchanged. Gideon turned back to the apartment. He stepped inside. He pulled the door closed behind him with a soft, final click. He looked at Maya, who had not moved, whose mouth was slightly open, who was holding her own wrist where Derek had grabbed it. "Does that hurt?" he asked. She looked at her wrist. "No." He nodded. His expression had not changed from the expression he wore when he was deciding whether the eggs needed more salt. He reached for the dish towel on the counter and dried his hands. "What do you want for dinner?" he said. The afternoon shift at Copper and Grounds was the kind of shift that made Maya remember why she loved the job, which was the kind of thought that preceded disaster with suspicious regularity. The rain had let up for the first time in 2 weeks, producing a pale and tentative light that fell through the shop's big front windows and made everything look slightly dreamlike. The afterwork crowd was starting to filter in. Someone had put on a record at the counter. Maya was pulling a double shot with the practiced ease of someone who could do it in her sleep, humming quietly to herself, thinking about whether Gideon would make dinner again, or whether tonight was her turn, when the front window exploded inward. Not broke, not cracked, exploded. The entire pane came apart in a single catastrophic moment, and 3 men were through it before the glass had finished falling, moving with a speed that was wrong in a way that registered before she could name why. They were large, all 3 of them, with a quality of coiled, barely restrained energy that made the air around them feel charged. The nearest one swept an arm across the counter and sent every cup and glass in reach crashing to the floor, and the customers who hadn't already bolted for the back door were now doing so, chairs scraping, someone screaming, the record scratching off its groove and leaving behind a silence that lasted about half a second before it was replaced by something much worse. "Maya Calloway," the first one said. He was looking directly at her. His eyes were wrong, too pale. The iris expanded in a way that did not track correctly with the light. She knew, in the animal part of her brain that did not deal in logic, that she should not be looking at his eyes. "We're not here for the register," he said. "We're here for you." She gripped the portafilter she was still holding. Her barista instincts, which were apparently the last to receive the distress signal, noted with distant irrelevance that she had just pulled a perfect shot and it was going to waste. The three men moved into the shop in a loose triangle, relaxed and deliberate, the way things moved when they were confident about the outcome. Then the door opened. She heard it behind her, the service entrance, which was supposed to be locked, which should not have opened from the outside, which opened anyway with a sound like a key that hadn't been a key at all. She turned. Gideon was standing in the doorway to the back hall. He was wearing his dark jacket. His hands were loose at his sides. He had found her the way she'd never been able to explain. The same way he'd been home early exactly twice when she'd needed someone to carry heavy groceries up the stairs. The same way he always seemed to already be awake when her alarm failed. He was looking at the three men, not at her, and the expression on his face was not alarm or fear or anything that she could read the way she could usually read faces. It was the absence of expression, a stillness so complete it felt like the moment before a very large thing fell. "Gideon," her voice came out thin. "These men, I think they have weapons. I think you should. You need to get out of here." He did not look at her. "Gideon." She moved toward him. She was not sure afterward exactly what she was thinking, except that the thought had been fast and uncomplicated and had arrived fully formed. He was her roommate. He was a bodyguard who was out of work and down on his luck. He was a big man, but there were three of them, and they moved wrong, and he needed to leave. She put herself between him and the nearest man. She was aware, distantly, that this was not a rational thing to do. She did it anyway. She turned to face the three men with her hands raised and her voice shaking and said, "Leave him out of this. He has nothing to do with whatever this is. He's nobody. Please." The room went very quiet. Behind her, she felt rather than heard something change. It was not a sound, exactly. It was a shift in the quality of the air, the way the atmosphere changes in the seconds before lightning, when the charge has already committed and the bolt is simply catching up. The hairs on her arms stood up. The closest man's pale eyes moved from her face to the space behind her, and for the first time, something moved across his expression that was close to uncertainty. "Maya," Gideon said. His voice was different. It was still low, still controlled, but there was something underneath it now that had not been there before, a frequency that she felt in her chest more than heard with her ears, a resonance that had no business coming from a human throat. "Step to the side." She turned. His eyes were burning amber, not reflecting the light, generating it. The irises had gone fully gold, bright and feral and absolutely inhuman, and the expression on his face had been replaced by something older than expression, something that had no interest in the careful human architecture he normally maintained. Every muscle in his body had gone rigid with an effort she could see working through him, through his jaw, his neck, his hands, and his hands were shaking, which she had never seen, and his clothes were pulling at the seams at his shoulders and across his chest. "What?" she started. "Get behind the counter," he said, and the words came out rough, distorted at the edges. "Now! Do not look!" She did not get behind the counter. She froze, which was not the same thing, and so she was standing there, unable to move, when Gideon Wolf stopped holding it back. She would not be able to describe it coherently afterward. The human mind processed certain things by converting them into narrative, and there were events that resisted that conversion, events that the brain stored instead as pure sensation, as impression, as a sequence of overwhelming physical experiences, stripped of their connective tissue. She heard fabric tear. She heard something that was not a human sound, and was not any animal sound she had a reference for, a sound that started in the chest and expanded outward until it became a pressure wave, a roar that shook the glass cases on the back wall and knocked two cups from their hooks and hit her sternum like a fist. The lights in the shop flickered. She was on her knees on the floor behind the counter, and she did not remember going there. What came next was fast. That was the only word for it. She pressed her back against the cabinets and kept her head down, and it was fast. Impacts that shook the floor, the sound of the display shelves going over, something heavy striking the far wall, hard enough to crack the plaster. The three men had moved like something inhuman. What was dealing with them moved like something more. She heard them. She heard what happened to them. She did not look, because some part of her had understood finally and completely that this was not a robbery, and the thing that was protecting her was not her roommate, and she was not equipped to categorize what she was currently in the middle of. And then it stopped. The shop was wrecked. The front counter had been knocked off its base. The floor was covered in broken things. The three men who had come through the window were no longer standing, were no longer in any condition to stand, were crumpled against the walls and the overturned furniture with the specific stillness of things that had been handled with absolute finality. None of them were dead. She understood this without knowing how she understood it. They were breathing, barely, and would remain breathing, because the thing that had done this had chosen to leave it at that. In the center of the destroyed room, on the floor, was Gideon. He was himself again. Human-shaped, human-sized, though even human-sized, even folded down to one knee on the floor, with his head bent, he was enormous. He was naked. His clothes were gone entirely. The expensive dark jacket and shirt and trousers converted to debris scattered across the wreckage around him. He was covered in blood, most of it not his. The scars she had seen in the hallway 2 nights ago were more visible now, pale and extensive against his skin. He was breathing hard, his broad back heaving with it, his hands flat against the floor. He did not stand up. After a moment, he turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were still glowing faintly, the amber not yet faded, and in his face, the face she had learned to read in small increments over the past week. The controlled face, the careful face, there was something utterly exposed. He was looking at her the way a person looks when they have handed over the thing they were most afraid to hand over and are waiting, perfectly still, for the verdict. He was terrified, not of the men on the floor, of her. Maya stared at him across the wreckage of the coffee shop where she had worked for 2 years. Her hands had stopped shaking. The cold had gone out of her chest and been replaced by something else, something that she did not have a word for, that she suspected would require some processing time and a very large cup of coffee made on a $30,000 machine. She looked at him for a long time. Then she pulled herself to her feet, picked her way through the broken glass and overturned furniture, and crouched down in front of him on the floor. She did not say anything immediately. She looked at his face, at the glowing eyes and the barely contained power that was still working out of his system, and at the fear underneath all of it. "You're bleeding," she said finally, touching her own shoulder to indicate where on him the cut was. His jaw worked. "Maya." "I know," she said. She didn't know. Not all of it. Not yet. But she knew the important part. "I know." The helicopters came down out of the low clouds like something from a dream that had not yet decided whether it was good or bad. 3 of them, matte black, unmarked, settling onto the street outside the coffee shop with a precision that suggested the pilots had done this kind of thing in places considerably less convenient than a rain-slicked commercial block in the Millfield district. The rotor wash flattened the puddles and sent a torn paper cup spinning across the sidewalk. The doors opened before the skids had fully touched down. The men who emerged were armored and armed and moved with the disciplined efficiency of people whose entire professional existence was organized around a single principle. They fanned out, established a perimeter, and then as one, as if a signal had passed between them that Maya could not hear, they stopped and bowed, not nodded, not inclined their heads in a professional gesture of acknowledgement. Bowed, deeply, formally, with their eyes on the ground. Gideon was standing in the wreckage of the front doorway, wearing a jacket that one of the first guards through had immediately and wordlessly produced and placed around his shoulders. He had not looked at Maya while this was happening. He was looking at the street, at the helicopters, at the armed men with their heads lowered, with the expression of a man who has been caught in the middle of something he cannot explain in any order that will make sense. Then he looked at her. She was standing 2 feet behind him, her arms crossed over her chest, her hazel eyes moving from the helicopters to the guards to his face, with the methodical attention of someone assembling a puzzle she had been working on for a week, without the picture on the box. She was doing the accounting, the coffee machine, the cash in the envelope. The way he moved, the way he talked, the way he stood in a room as if the room had been placed there for his convenience. The way the armed men outside were bowing. "Gideon," she said, "I can explain. Can you?" It was not really a question. He turned to face her. He was wearing someone else's jacket over bare skin. There was blood drying on his collarbone, and he looked, for the first time since she had opened her door to a man in a soaked designer suit 11 days ago, like he did not entirely know what to do with his hands. "Yes," he said. "All of it." He took her to the penthouse. She had never been to the top of the Wolf Tower, which she now understood was named that for a reason that was not coincidental. The elevator opened directly into a space that made her stop walking and simply stand for a moment, recalibrating. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. Raincrest City spread below in every direction, its lights multiplied in the wet streets, the whole skyline visible from a height that made the rain look decorative rather than oppressive. The interior was all dark stone and warm light and furniture that cost what her apartment's building had cost, and it was immaculately organized. And it smelled faintly like him, cedar and dark cold air, and she understood that she was standing in the real version of the man who had been sleeping in her 6x8 guest room for a week and a half. She turned around. He told her everything. It took a long time. He told her about the syndicate, the hidden world, the shifter hierarchy that ran beneath the surface of the city, like a second circulatory system. He told her about the traitors in his inner circle, and why he had gone undercover, and what he had needed to find. He told her what he was, what the amber eyes meant, what the roar meant, what it meant when a wolf's instincts identified someone as a fated mate, with a certainty that made every other consideration secondary to simply being in the same room as her. He told her about the cash in the envelope, and the espresso machine, and why he had cooked dinner every night without being asked, standing in her small kitchen in the apron with the sunflowers, producing food that he would never have described as anything but practical. He stood across the room while he said it, his arms at his sides, not moving toward her, giving her the distance. When he finished, the room was quiet, and the rain had started again outside the windows, and Raincrest City glittered below them in the dark. Maya stared at him. "You told me you were unemployed," she said. "I am, technically, not employed. I own the company. You told me the espresso machine was on sale. Everything is on sale relative to something. You slept in my guest room." He held her gaze. "Yes, for 11 days. Yes. A billionaire alpha king," she said, testing the shape of the words. "Slept in my guest room, on that bed." She paused. "That bed is the size of a door." "I'm aware." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the room. He watched her come, his expression doing the thing it did when he was working to keep it neutral, when the controlled architecture of his face was doing significant structural work. She stopped directly in front of him, which meant she was looking up at a considerable angle, and she saw him swallow. "You were terrified," she said. "Back there, in the shop. You looked at me, and you were terrified." "Yes," he said very quietly. "Of me. Of what you would do when you knew what I was." She held his gaze. She thought about the espresso machine and the sunflower apron, and the way he sat at her small kitchen table like a general, at a field post, hands around a coffee mug that he had given his full and serious trust. She thought about him on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark, and the faint amber glow she had half-dreamed once in the night and filed away without examining. She thought about the hallway, and Derek, and the casual, complete protection of it, and the way he had dried his hands on the dish towel and asked her what she wanted for dinner. She reached up, grabbed him by the tie, the one the guard had produced along with the jacket, because apparently the men who worked for him carried emergency suit components, pulled down, and kissed him. He went absolutely still for half a second, the way he went still when something was overriding everything he knew how to do. Then he stopped being still. His hands came up and found her, and the careful control he maintained at all times over the scale of himself dissolved completely, and he held her the way she would understand later he had wanted to hold her, since the first moment he had crossed her threshold, the way a person holds something they were not sure they were allowed to have, with a thoroughness that made the concept of letting go feel theoretical. He was enormous and warm, and she could feel the tension going out of him in waves. 11 days of coiled, tortured restraint releasing all at once, and it turned out that the terrifying billionaire Alpha King, ruler of the hidden world, was the most profoundly touch-starved individual she had ever had her arms around. She laughed against his mouth. She couldn't help it. He pulled back by an inch. "What?" "Nothing." She was smiling so hard her face hurt. "Nothing. Come here." He did. 6 months later, the rain over Raincrest City had become familiar in the way that things become familiar when you stop waiting for them to end and start building your life inside them. The Wolf Tower penthouse had acquired several new canvases, a second espresso machine in the studio that Gideon had initially objected to on the grounds that the first one was sufficient, and a collection of small ceramic figures on the kitchen windowsill that had no explanation other than that Maya had seen them in a market and liked them. He had not moved them. He had, after 3 weeks, begun to arrange them with a precision that he would not acknowledge if asked. The syndicate traitors had been dealt with, cleanly and completely, in ways that the hidden world understood, and the regular world did not need to. The Alpha King had returned to his throne, which was to say, his boardroom and his empire, and the vast machinery of power that answered to him, with a fated maid on his arm, who still occasionally called him her down-on-his-luck roommate in front of his lieutenants, and watched the resulting series of expressions cross their faces with visible enjoyment. The meeting on the 14th floor of the Wolf Tower was a major one. 9 executives, 3 continents of representatives connected by secure line, a $12 billion merger that had been 18 months in negotiation, and was now, finally, in its concluding hours. Gideon sat at the head of the table in a suit that had been made for him by the same tailor who had remade 4 others in the past 6 months after certain structural incidents had rendered them non-functional, and he was precisely and formidably in command of every detail of the proceeding, as he always was, as everyone in the room expected him to be. His phone, face down on the table beside his folio, lit up. He glanced at it. His expression did not change. His chief of staff, seated 2 chairs to his left, who had worked for him for 7 years and had survived things that would have retired most people, saw his eyes drop to the screen and recognized the specific quality of what happened next. Gideon closed his folio. "We'll adjourn for the afternoon," he said. 9 executives looked at him. The representatives on the secure line did not say anything, because they had learned that when the Alpha King said something in that particular tone, the sentence that followed was not a discussion. "Sir," his chief of staff said carefully, "the closing window will still be there tomorrow." He stood. "Clear my afternoon." He picked up his phone and was typing a reply before he reached the door. The message from Maya was 3 sentences. The first said she was near the market on Selden Street. The second described, in the specific and enthusiastic detail she brought to most things, a pastry she had seen in the window of a bakery that she couldn't justify buying because she had already had coffee. The third sentence said, "Never mind, it's silly. Don't worry about it." He was in the elevator before his chief of staff had finished processing the image of the $12 billion boardroom now sitting empty on the 14th floor. The bakery on Selden Street was small and warm and smelled like sugar and something spiced. He walked in, identified the pastry from Maya's description in approximately 4 seconds, bought 3 of them, and was back outside in under 2 minutes. He found her half a block away, chestnut curls damp from the rain, carrying a canvas under one arm and squinting into the window of a hardware shop at something he'd have to inspect before she bought it. She turned when she heard him, and her face did what it always did when she saw him. Opened, lit up, entirely unguarded, and he held out the paper bag, and she took it and looked inside and made a sound that he had concluded, after some months of accumulating evidence, was the single best sound he had ever heard. "You were in that big meeting," she said. "I adjourned it." She looked up at him. "Gideon, it was the merger. It will still be a merger tomorrow." He held her gaze. "You wanted the pastry." She stared at him for a moment with the expression she sometimes wore when she was deciding whether to argue with him, which was the expression she wore when she had already decided not to. Then she went up on her toes, pressed a kiss to his jaw, and tucked herself under his arm the way she had learned she fit there, precisely and completely, like the specific space had always been waiting. He wrapped his arm around her. He looked out at the rain over Raincrest City, at the lights beginning to come on in the early dark, at the skyline that belonged to him in every technical and legal sense, and had never, not once, meant as much as the weight of her against his side. He stood there in the rain outside the bakery with his arm around his mate, and the $12 billion merger waited. And he did not hurry. If you enjoyed this Billionaire Shifter romance audiobook, please hit the like button and subscribe for more epic stories.